On the coldest morning of the year, they threw an old man out of a café into the snow. He was 79 years old. He was a veteran, 2 tours in Vietnam. And he had come in out of the cold with 85 cents in his glove, and the hope of a cup of coffee and a few minutes of warmth, and a well-dressed customer had decided he was an eyesore. And a frightened young employee had done what he was told. And the old soldier had been put out onto the sidewalk in the falling snow with a whole room watching and not one person moving. Not one. Except the man who was in the back when it happened. The owner of that cafe came out wiping his hands. And when he understood what had just been done in his father's place, in the room under his father's flag, he did not raise his voice, and he did not make a speech. He reached up behind his neck, and he untied his apron, and he pulled it off over his head, and he set it down on the counter. And then he walked out into the snow after the old man. And what he did next stopped a room full of strangers cold, shut down a powerful man without a single threat, and set in motion something not one person in that cafe saw coming. Because what the owner did not know, what the old veteran did not know, was that the two of them had already been bound together for 50 years by a name on the wall and a debt that had been paid, once, in blood. Stay with me all the way to the end, because this is a story about the people we decide to throw away, and the ones who walk out into the cold to pick them back up, and it is going to stay with you a long time. And before we begin, do me one kindness and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It always means more than you know. Caldwell's had stood on the same corner in Pittsburgh for 41 years. And for 41 years it had smelled, from 6 in the morning, of coffee and bacon, and the particular griddle warmth that a certain kind of old cafe has, and that no new place, however expensive, has ever once managed to fake. Earl Caldwell had opened it in 1983 with his Army separation pay, and a loan he was not really qualified for. A young black veteran back from a war the country wanted to forget, who had come home to a city that did not have much use for him, and had decided, with the stubbornness that his son would inherit whole, to build himself a place where he had use for everybody. He had run that griddle for 30 years, and when Earl died, his son Otis, who had grown up wiping those tables and had gone away and tried other lives and found that none of them were his, came home and tied on his father's apron and kept the place exactly as it had been. Because some things, Otis believed, were not businesses, they were promises. And you did not improve a promise, you kept it. The promise was on the wall, if you knew where to look. Behind the register, in a simple frame, was a photograph of a young man in uniform, lean and serious, 19 years old, Earl Caldwell in 1969, before the war and the cafe and the sun and all the rest of the life that photograph did not yet know it was going to have. And beside it, in a triangle case of wood and glass, was a folded flag, the one they had given Otis at his father's graveside, and beneath the two of them, on a small brass plate Earl had screwed to the wall himself decades ago, were the words that were the entire reason Caldwell's existed, the rule Earl had laid down on the first day and never once bent. As long as that griddle's hot, no veteran in this town eats cold or eats alone. Earl had meant it literally. For 30 years, any man or woman who came into Caldwell's and had served got a hot plate whether they could pay or not. No questions, no fuss, set down in front of them like it was owed. Because to Earl Caldwell, it was. He had come home cold and alone himself once to a country that looked through him. And he had decided that no one was going to be cold or alone in any room he owned. Otis had grown up on that rule the way other children grow up on prayers. He could not remember a time he had not known it. It was, as much as the building or the griddle or the name over the door, the thing he had inherited. Otis knew the story of the rule because his father had told it to him exactly once. The way men of Earl's generation told the important things, briefly, and only one time, and never again. Earl had come home from Vietnam in the early 70s, to the same cold welcome Clarence had, a young black veteran of an unpopular war in a country that had no parade and no job and no thank you for him. And there had been a stretch, before the café, before he found his feet, that Earl almost never spoke of, when he had been about as far down as a man gets, cold and broke and alone in a city that looked straight through him. And he had learned in those months what it is to be hungry in a country full of food and invisible in a city full of people. He never forgot it, and when he finally clawed his way up and scraped together the money to open a little café of his own, the very first thing Earl Caldwell did, before the first plate was ever served, was screw a brass plate to the wall with a rule on it. Because he had decided down in those cold months that if he ever owned a single warm room in this world, no one who had served was ever going to be cold or alone in it the way he had been. The rule was not charity. To Earl it was a debt, a thing he owed forward, paid to strangers because the people he actually owed it to were scattered or dead or unfindable. For 30 years he paid it, one hot plate at a time, to anyone who came in wearing the invisible mark he recognized because he carried it himself. Otis had grown up watching his father pay that debt and had never fully understood, until a snowy morning 50 years later, that the rule his father wrote for strangers had a particular man's name on it all along, and the thing he had inherited was in trouble, because Caldwell sat on a corner that had become, in the last few years, valuable. The neighborhood was changing, the way neighborhoods do. The old businesses closing one by one, the rents climbing. And a development group had been buying up the block parcel by parcel with plans for something glass and tall and profitable. And they wanted Caldwell's corner, and Otis would not sell. The pressure had been mounting for a year, the letters, the offers, the visits from a smooth man named Grant Holloway, who represented the group and who treated Otis every time with the patient contempt of a man certain that everyone has a price, and that finding it is just a matter of time. Otis did not have a price, but he had something almost as dangerous, which was rising rent and thinning margins, and a café full of regulars who could not pay much. And the cold arithmetic of it was that Caldwell's might not make it whether Otis sold or not. And Otis knew it, and carried it, and got up every morning at 4:30 and ran the griddle anyway, because his father had not quit, and neither would he. Otis had not always known he would come home to it. He had grown up in that café, wiping the tables and refilling the coffee and doing his homework in the back booth while his father worked the griddle. And like a lot of sons of hard-working fathers, he had wanted for a while to be anything other than what his father was. He had gone away to school, worked in an office downtown for a few years in a tie that never felt like his, tried on a couple of cities and a couple of versions of himself, and had slowly come to understand the thing a man often only understands once his father is gone, which was that the life he had been running from was the only one that had ever fit him. When Earl got sick, Otis came home to help. And when Earl died, Otis stood at the graveside and took the folded flag from the honor guard and went back and opened the café the next morning at 6, because it had never once not opened at 6 in 40 years. And he was not going to be the reason it started. He tied on his father's apron, and he never took it off again. He was not trying to get rich. You did not run a place like Caldwell's to get rich. You ran it because it was a way of keeping faith with the dead and feeding the living. And those were the only two things Otis Caldwell had ever found that he believed in all the way down. Which was exactly why the development group could not understand him, and why Grant Holloway kept coming back. To Holloway and the men he worked for, Caldwell's was a number, an underperforming parcel on a corner that could be so much more. And a man who would not sell such a thing for well over what it was worth was not a man with principles. He was a man who had not yet heard a big enough number, so they kept saying bigger numbers. Holloway would come in and sit at the window table and slide a folder across and talk in the warm, reasonable voice of a man who has never once doubted he will get what he wants. About how the neighborhood was changing, about how everything ends, about how sentiment was a luxury a man with thinning margins could not afford. And Otis would refill the man's coffee and tell him every time the same thing: that the café was not for sale, that some things were not numbers. And Holloway would smile the smile of a man who believes that is simply the opening position in a negotiation, and leave and come back the next week. He had been at it a year. He thought he was wearing Otis down. What he did not understand, what men like him never understand, was that he was sitting every week in a room built on a promise, and that the man refilling his coffee would burn the place to the ground before he would break it. If a story about a man keeping his father's promise when the whole world is telling him to sell it is the reason you're here tonight, then make sure you're subscribed. Because what walked through Otis Caldwell's door on the coldest morning of the year is the entire reason this story exists. It was the third week of January, and the cold that morning was the kind that hurts. Single digits with a wind off the rivers that found every gap in a coat. And the café was busy with the breakfast rush, the windows fogged, the bell over the door ringing, when an old man came in out of the snow. He came in slow, the way the very old and the very cold come in. And he stood a moment just inside the door, letting the warmth find him. A thin man in a threadbare olive field jacket gone gray at the seams, a faded embroidered cap pulled low, fingerless gloves, snow melting on his shoulders. He was somebody's idea of invisible, the kind of old man a busy room slides its eyes past. But if you had looked, really looked, you would have seen that he stood up straight. Straighter than his years, an old habit drilled into a young body a long time ago and never lost. And you would have seen the careful dignity with which he made his way to the counter. And you would have seen, if you were close, the embroidery on the faded cap, a unit, a war, a thing he had been that the room would never have guessed. His name was Clarence Boyd, and he was 79 years old, and he had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a young man. And he had come home, like Earl Caldwell, to a country that would rather not be reminded. And he had built a quiet, ordinary life anyway, work and a marriage, and no children that lived. And he had buried his wife 6 years ago, and most of his friends before that. And he lived now alone in a single rented room 4 blocks from Caldwell's on a fixed income that the cost of everything had been quietly outrunning for years. He was not, on that morning, technically homeless. He was something the country has a great many more of and notices even less, an old veteran living right at the knife's edge of it, alone, cold, proud, counting coins. The kind of man who is invisible precisely because he works so hard to keep himself neat and quiet, and no trouble to anybody. Clarence Boyd had not always been invisible. There had been a whole life, a long one, before the cold room and the 85 cents. He had come home from his second tour in 1971 to a country that crossed the street to avoid men in his uniform. And he had swallowed that the way his generation swallowed most things, in silence, and gone to work. 31 years at the rail yard. Honest work that wore his body out by inches and asked no questions about what he had seen. He had married a woman named Della, who saw the good in him that the war had tried to bury. And they had been happy in the small, sufficient way that does not make it into stories. And they had wanted children and lost the 2 that came too early, and had made their peace with that too. Together, the way they made their peace with everything. together. And then, 6 years ago, Della had died. The way long marriages end, with one of them simply left holding the other's empty coat. And Clarence Boyd had discovered the particular cold of an old man alone, which is colder than any weather. The friends went the way friends go at his age, one a year, then more than one. The funerals outpacing the birthdays until there were no birthdays left to attend, only services. And then not even those, because there was no one left who would have come to his. The pension and the small benefits had been enough once. But enough is a moving target. And the rent on the single room climbed, and the cost of the medicine climbed, and the cost of everything climbed. And Clarence's careful arithmetic had been losing a little ground every year, until he had arrived, without ever being able to point to the day it happened, at a life measured in coins, where heat was a thing you rationed, and $1 coffee was a decision. He was not bitter about it. That was the thing that would have broken your heart if you had known him. That he was not bitter. That he kept his one room clean, and his one good shirt pressed, and his shoes shined with an old soldier's discipline. That he said good morning to people who did not say it back. That he was, after a war and a country's indifference and the loss of every single person he had ever loved, still a gentleman, still unfailingly polite, still trying, at 79, to be no trouble to anybody. That is who they put out into the snow. He came to Caldwell's that morning for the oldest and humblest of reasons. He was cold, and his room was barely heated because the heat cost money, and he had 85 cents. And he had thought, the way you think when you are old and alone and cold, that he might sit somewhere warm for a little while with a cup of coffee and be among people, even people who did not know him, even just the sound and warmth of a room with life in it, before the long day alone in the cold room. That was all he wanted, a cup of coffee he could almost afford, and to not be alone and cold for an hour. He did not know about Earl Caldwell's rule. He could not have known that he had walked, half frozen, into the one café in the city built from the ground, up on the promise that no veteran would ever be cold or alone in it. He only knew it was warm, and that the coffee was $1, and that he had 85 cents, and he came to the counter to ask, with the painful dignity of a proud man 15 cents short, whether that would be enough. He never got to ask, because the breakfast rush was on, and the young man at the register was new, 18 years old, 3 weeks into his first real job, terrified of losing it. And at one of the good tables by the window sat Grant Holloway, the development man, who was there that morning not by accident, having taken to holding court at Caldwell's as a small act of dominance over the owner who would not sell. And Grant Holloway looked up from his phone and saw a shabby old man in a ratty coat shuffling to the counter, snow melting onto the floor. And Grant Holloway made a face and said loudly enough for the room, and especially for the new kid to hear, that this was a café, not a shelter. And that surely they did not let people like that come in and lower the tone and bother the paying customers. And was someone going to handle it or not? This is the moment the whole story turns on. So if you are not subscribed, do it now. Because what one frightened kid did, and then what one steady man did about it, is the heart of everything I want to tell you tonight. The kid, Trey, froze. He was 18 and scared and new. And here was a well-dressed, important-seeming customer telling him to do something. And the owner was in the back, and Trey did the thing that frightened young people do when an authority leans on them. He obeyed the loudest voice in the room. He came around the counter, and he was not cruel. He was just weak in the particular way the young are weak before they learn what they're made of. And he told the old man, not unkindly but firmly, that he was sorry but he couldn't loiter, that he'd have to order or move along. And when Clarence, flustered, started to explain about the 85 cents, the kid, with Grant Holloway watching and his job on the line in his mind, panicked and just steered the old man toward the door, a hand on his elbow, out into the cold. And the bell rang, and the door closed, and Clarence Boyd was standing on the sidewalk in the snow, where a moment before he had been almost warm. The cafe had gone quiet. The specific guilty quiet of a room that has all just watched something it knows was wrong, and that no one stopped. People looked at their plates. Grant Holloway went back to his phone, satisfied, and out on the sidewalk, the old man stood for a moment in the falling snow, getting his bearings. And then he squared his thin shoulders the way he had been squaring them for 60 years. And he started slowly to shuffle away down the cold street, alone, the way he had been told the world wanted him, and nobody in that warm cafe moved a single muscle to stop it, except that the door to the kitchen swung open, and Otis Caldwell came out. He had been in the back, working the griddle, and he had heard the loud voice and felt the room go wrong the way you feel weather change. And he came out, wiping his hands on a towel, and took in the scene in about 2 seconds. The guilty quiet, the satisfied man at the window table, the new kid white-faced by the door, and the melting snow on the floor, and the empty space at the counter where someone had just been. "Where's the old fella that just came in?" Otis said. And the room would not look at him. And finally Trey, miserable, said he. He had to ask him to leave. "Mr. Caldwell?" "He was," the gentleman said. And Otis followed the kid's frightened glance to Grant Holloway at the window table. And Otis Caldwell understood, all at once, exactly what had happened in his father's cafe, under his father's flag, 10 feet from the brass plate that had hung on that wall for 41 years. And Otis Caldwell did not yell. That was the thing the whole room remembered afterward, the way the people who tell this story always tell it. He did not yell. He went very still and very calm, the dangerous calm of a patient man who has finally found the thing he will not be patient about. He looked at the flag on the wall, his father's flag, and he looked at the brass plate. And he reached up behind his neck and untied his apron, slow, and pulled it off over his head, and folded it once, and set it on the counter. And he said, to no one and to everyone, "Quiet. That's not how we do it here." And then he walked past Grant Holloway without a glance and out the door into the snow, in his shirt sleeves, in the single-digit cold, after the old man. He caught him half a block down, a thin figure shuffling into the wind, and Otis came up beside him and slowed to his pace and said gently, so as not to frighten him, "Sir. Sir. Please." And Clarence stopped and turned, wary, braced for more of what he had just gotten. And Otis Caldwell, the owner of the cafe that had just thrown this man into the cold, stood there in his shirt sleeves with snow gathering on his shoulders, and said the thing his father had taught him. "Sir, I am so sorry. That was wrong, what happened in there, and it is not how we do things. And I would be honored if you would come back inside, out of this cold, and let me make you breakfast. On the house. Every bit of it. Please." He held out his arm. Clarence Boyd looked at him a long moment. This stranger who had come out into the cold without a coat to chase down an old man nobody wanted. And something in the old soldier's careful face, some wall that had been up a very long time, came down a little, and he took the offered arm, and the two of them walked back through the snow to Caldwell's together. And here is where Otis Caldwell did the thing that the people in that cafe would tell their families about that night. He did not bring the old man in the back way or sit him quietly in a corner to spare anyone embarrassment. He brought him in the front door, and he walked him, slow, through the silent staring room. And he sat Clarence Boyd down at the best table in the house, the big one in the window, the very table where Grant Holloway was sitting. And Otis looked at Holloway and said evenly, "You're done here, sir. Get your coat." And when Holloway started to bluster about being a paying customer, Otis said the line that someone in the cafe had already started filming on her phone. The line that would, by that evening, be seen by a great many people. "Your money's no good here anymore." "But his is." He nodded at Clarence. "And his always will be. Now get your coat." And Grant Holloway, who had never in his life been put out of anywhere, found that there was nothing to be done in the face of a calm man and a watching room. And he got his coat and he left, and the door rang behind him, and Otis Caldwell turned to the old veteran sitting at the best table and tied on a fresh apron and said, "Now, what can I get you, soldier? It's on the house, and it always will be, and I'll explain why in a minute. Coffee first." You look froze through. The cafe, which had been silent with shame, began, table by table, to do something. An old man at the counter started it, a retiree who came every day. He stood up and walked over and shook Clarence's hand and thanked him for his service, simple as that, and sat back down. Then a young mother brought her little boy over to say hello. Then someone quietly told the new kid Trey to go on and bring the man some of the good orange juice. And Trey, who had been standing frozen and stricken by the register, his eyes full, near tears with the shame of what he'd done, all but ran to do it, grateful beyond words for a way to begin to make it right. The room was repairing itself, the way a good room will, once one person shows it how. It is a strange and hopeful thing to watch, a room deciding to be better than it just was. For a few minutes, Caldwell's had been every place where something wrong happens and everyone lets it. And then one man had refused. And now, table by table, the room was discovering that it had wanted to be good all along and had only needed someone to go first. The shame in the air turned, slowly, into something warmer. The particular tenderness of people who have been given a second chance, at a moment they thought they had failed. The retiree who had shaken Clarence's hand stayed standing by the table, talking with him about nothing, about the cold, about the Steelers, the small, holy nothing that says you are a person and I see you. Someone quietly paid for a round of coffee for the whole cafe. And Trey, 18 years old, who had done the actual deed, who had put his hand on a hero's elbow and steered him into the snow, stood by the register and shook, because he understood with the terrible clarity of the young exactly what he had done and exactly what it said about the kind of man he had been in that moment. He was waiting, he later admitted, to be fired, and would have deserved it, and was already grieving a job and a self he had wrecked in 30 seconds of cowardice. He did not yet know what kind of man ran this cafe. He was about to find out that too. If you've made it this far with me, you already feel where this is going. But I promise you do not yet know the half of it. So stay with me. Because what happened when that old soldier looked up from his coffee and saw the wall is the reason I had to tell you this story. Otis brought the coffee himself, and the breakfast after it, the full plate, eggs and bacon and grits and toast, set down in front of Clarence Boyd the way Earl Caldwell had set down 10,000 plates like it was owed. And Clarence ate slowly, with the careful manners of a proud man, and his eyes were wet. And Otis sat down across from him for a minute the way his father used to, and said, "I owe you an explanation about the on the house." And he pointed at the wall, at the photograph and the flag and the brass plate. And he said, "That was my father, Earl Caldwell. He served in Vietnam, came home, opened this place. And that rule on the plate there, no veteran eats cold or alone, that's his. That's the whole reason this cafe exists. So you didn't get charity just now, sir. You got what my father built this entire place to give. You just walked into the one cafe in Pittsburgh where you were never going to be allowed to be cold or alone. And we almost broke his rule on you. And I will be making that right for the rest of my life. And Clarence Boyd had gone very still, his fork down, staring at the photograph on the wall, the young man in uniform, 1969. And he said, in a voice that had changed, that had gone thin and strange, "What did you say his name was?" And Otis said, "Earl Caldwell." And the old man's hand began to shake, and he reached into the breast pocket of the threadbare field jacket, the pocket over his heart, and he drew out a small, creased photograph, soft with handling, 50 years old, that he carried with him everywhere and always had. And he laid it on the table with a trembling hand. And it was a photograph of two young soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning, impossibly young, in a place very far from Pittsburgh. And one of them was a young Clarence Boyd. And the other one was the exact same young man in the exact same uniform as the photograph on the wall behind the register. "Earl Caldwell," Clarence said. And the tears were running down the deep lines of his face now, openly, and he could barely get the words out. "Earl Caldwell was my brother, not by blood, by the other thing. We served together, 2 tours, your father and me. He pulled me out of a rice paddy in 1970 with 2 rounds in my leg and carried me half a mile under fire when everybody with sense would have left me. And the only reason I am sitting in this chair 79 years old to be thrown out into your snow this morning is that your father decided 50 years ago that he was not going to leave me behind. He saved my life. And I lost track of him after the war. The way you do, I always meant to find him. And I never did. And I did not know he had passed. And I did not know." He looked up at the wall, at the flag, his old face broken open with grief and wonder. "I did not know that all these years there was a place 4 blocks from my room, with his name over the door and his picture on the wall, and that the rule he made was, 'Oh son, he made that rule for me. He made that rule because of nights we spent cold and alone that nobody should spend. And I have walked past this corner 100 times and never once come in, until today. Until the one morning I was too cold to keep walking." Otis did not say anything. He could not. He just reached across the table and put his hand over the old man's shaking one. And Clarence, once he had started, could not stop, the whole of it pouring out of a man who had carried it alone for 50 years, with no one left who had been there. They had been kids together, he said. 18, 19. 2 black boys from 2 different cities thrown into a war neither of them understood. And they had done what you do. They had kept each other alive and kept each other human. Traded letters from home and photographs of girls and arguments about everything and dreams about after. And Earl had been the steady one. Earl had always been the steady one. The one who did not panic. The one who carried the others. On a day in 1970, in a place Clarence still could not say the name of without his voice changing, Clarence had been hit, twice, in the leg, and gone down in the water and the mud. And the order had come to fall back. And falling back was the right order, the sane order, and every man with sense was falling back. And Earl Caldwell had looked at the order and looked at Clarence in the water and made the other choice, the one that should have gotten them both killed, and come back through the fire and got him up out of that paddy and carried him half a mile on his back, the whole way to the line. And then the war had ended, and they had gone home to their separate cities and their separate silences. And they had written for a year or 2. And then life had done the thing life does, and the letters had stopped. And Clarence had always meant to find him, had carried the photograph in his breast pocket for 50 years, meaning to find him and had never done it, had never... I came in out of the cold, Clarence said. And the man whose flag is on that wall is the only reason I had a life to grow this old in. He saved me twice. Once in the water, and once this morning, through your hands, son. And he never even knew it would be your name that did it. Otis Caldwell sat in his father's café and looked at a photograph of his teenage father with his arm around the old man, weeping at the best table. The old man his father had carried half a mile under fire. The old man his own café had just put out into the snow. And Otis Caldwell put his face in his hands. Because the rule on the wall, the rule he had inherited and almost broken that very morning, turned out to have a name. And the name was sitting right in front of him, 85 cents in his glove, and had been 4 blocks away, cold and alone, for years. While the flag of the man who saved him hung framed on a wall the old soldier had never once walked past the doorway of. The whole cafe was crying now. The young mother, the retiree, Trey, openly by the register. Because they understood, all of them, that they had very nearly thrown the answer to the prayer on the wall out into the snow, and that something had reached out that cold morning and stopped them just in time. There is something this country does that this story is really about, and it is worth saying plainly. We are very good at honoring veterans in words, on a Thursday in November, with a flag and a thank you for your service, and we are very bad at honoring them, in fact, on a Tuesday in January, when one of them is old and cold and $4 short and standing at a counter. There are, on any given night in America, tens of thousands of veterans without homes, and vastly more living exactly where Clarence Boyd was living. One rent increase or one cold snap from the street. Old men and women who served and came home and grew old and quiet and invisible, outliving their friends, their spouses, sometimes their children, on fixed incomes that the cost of living has long since passed. Alone in single rooms, proud, neat, no trouble to anybody, slipping through every crack in a country that put their service on a bumper sticker and then stopped looking. We do not throw them out of cafes, most of us, not with our hands. But we throw them away, just the same, with our not looking, every single day. Earl Caldwell knew that. It is the entire reason he screwed a brass plate to a wall. And the miracle of this story is not that one old soldier turned out to be connected to one cafe. The miracle is that one man took off his apron and refused, for one morning, to let the throwing away happen in a room he was responsible for. What Otis Caldwell did not know, what none of them knew, was that the whole thing had been witnessed by someone with the means to make it more than a beautiful morning. She had been sitting alone at a small table by the wall the entire time. An elegant, composed, older woman, in a good but quiet coat, with a newspaper and a pot of tea, a woman the room had paid no more attention to than it had paid the old veteran, which was its own kind of lesson. Her name was Ada Presley, and she was 70 years old. And she had built, over a long, hard life that had started not far from this very corner, a successful chain of businesses and a personal fortune that no one in that cafe would have guessed at from her quiet coat. And she had come into Caldwell's that morning for the first time in years, on a whim. Because she had grown up 2 streets over, and the place reminded her of her youth. And she had watched the entire thing unfold over the top of her newspaper, the cruelty and the apron and the snow and the bringing back and the flag and the photograph and the weeping. And Ada Presley, who had spent a long time among powerful people and had a finely tuned sense for the difference between performance and the real thing, had recognized that she was watching the real thing, the rarest thing, a man doing right at cost to himself when it would have been so much easier to stay in the back and keep the paying customer happy. Ada Presley knew that cafe better than Otis could have guessed, though she had not set foot in it in 40 years. She had grown up 2 streets over. in the years when the neighborhood was poor and proud and entirely overlooked. And she had clawed her own way out of it and up. Through decades of being the only woman in the room and usually the only black face in it, building a chain of businesses with the kind of relentless discipline that leaves a person rich and a little lonely. She had learned, along that long climb, to read people fast and to trust almost no one, because almost everyone who got near a person with money wanted a piece of it, and the wanting wore 1,000 pleasant faces. She had developed, as a kind of armor, an unerring instinct for the difference between a person performing goodness where it would be seen and rewarded, and a person simply being good because they did not know how to be anything else. She saw the first kind constantly. She had nearly forgotten the second kind existed. And then, on a whim, on a cold morning, missing a neighborhood that mostly no longer existed, she had walked into the café on the old corner with a newspaper. And she had watched a man come out of a kitchen and find his whole café complicit in a cruelty. And she had watched him, with no idea anyone who mattered was looking, with every easy reason to stay in the back and keep his paying customer and his quiet morning, take off his apron and walk into the snow. She had watched him do the second kind of thing, the real kind, the kind she had stopped believing in, and she had felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the plain desire to be of use. She did not move that morning. Ada Presley had not gotten where she was by acting on feeling. She watched, and she listened, and she went home, and she made some calls, and she found out everything. The corner, the development group, the offers, the slow noose around a good man's neck. And then she did the thing she had spent 50 years learning to do better than almost anyone alive, which was to move decisively, with a great deal of money, toward a thing she had decided was worth it. She did not interrupt. She let the morning be what it was. But she stayed after the rush thinned, and when Otis was wiping down the counter, still shaken, she came up and introduced herself. And she said she had watched what happened. And she asked him a few quiet questions about the café, about the rule, about the development group and the corner, and how long he thought he could hold on. And Otis, who had no idea who she was, told her the truth, because he was too tired and too raw that morning to do anything else, that he probably couldn't hold on much longer, that the rent and the offers and the arithmetic were closing in, that he was likely going to lose his father's place no matter what he did, and that the only thing he knew for sure was that he was going to keep his father's rule right up until the day they took the keys. And Ada Presley listened and nodded and thanked him and finished her tea and left. And Otis thought no more about it, because powerful people did not save cafes like his. That was not how the world he knew worked. If your heart is full right now, that's the story doing its work, and this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because what that quiet woman did next is the part of this story I most want you to carry with you. The young woman who had filmed it on her phone posted the video that afternoon. A minute and a half of a cafe owner taking off his apron and walking into the snow and bringing an old soldier back to the best table and saying, "Your money's no good here, but his always will be." And by the next morning, it had been seen hundreds of thousands of times, and then millions. Because the world, for all its hardness, is starving for exactly this. For proof that the throwing away is not the only thing we do. And the things that happen when a thing like that travels began to happen. People drove across the city to eat at Caldwell's. The line went out the door into the cold. Veterans came, in caps like Clarence's, to shake Otis's hand and sit under Earl's flag. And the cafe that had been dying of a thinning neighborhood was suddenly, overnight, the most beloved corner in Pittsburgh. and the register rang, and for the first time in years, Otis Caldwell did the books at night and did not feel the cold arithmetic closing in. The strangers came first, drawn by the video, wanting to stand for a minute in a place where the thing they had watched had really happened. And they ordered more than they needed and tipped like they were trying to pay down a debt of their own. And they asked, shyly, to see the wall, the flag, the photograph, the brass plate. And Otis showed them every time and told them the story and watched it change them the way it had changed the room that first morning. Then came the veterans, which was the part that undid Otis. They came in their caps, Vietnam and Korea and the Gulf and the long wars after, old and young, alone and in pairs. And they came not for a free breakfast. Most of them insisted on paying, but to sit for an hour under the flag of a man who had decided 50 years ago that they would never be cold or alone, in a city that had just been forcibly reminded that too many of them were. They would shake Otis's hand and not let go. And some of them would stand in front of the photograph of young Earl Caldwell and bring their hand up, slow, and hold a salute. An old man saluting a young man, 50 years dead, who had kept a promise to people he never met. And Otis would have to step into the back so they would not see him come apart. The cafe that had been quietly dying filled up and stayed full. And one night, Otis set down his pen over the books in the empty room and realized he had not thought about the rent or the offers or Grant Holloway in 2 weeks. And he looked up at his father's flag and said, out loud, to no one, well, Pop, look at that. And somewhere in the silence, he could almost hear the old man say what he always said, that he had never doubted it, that you keep the rule and the rule keeps you, and that the griddle stays hot. But a viral moment is a wave, and waves go back out. And Otis knew it, knew that the crowds would thin and the development group would still own the block and the rent would still climb. That a beautiful morning does not by itself save a building. And that is when Ada Presley came back. She came back 2 weeks later in her quiet coat, and she sat down at the counter. And she told Otis Caldwell who she was, the businesses, the means, and she told him what she had done. She had bought the building, the whole parcel, the corner, out from under the development group, paid more than it was worth to take it off the table for good. And she was deeding the cafe's space to a trust, with terms that fixed Otis's rent at a number a cafe could actually survive on, in perpetuity. So that Caldwell's could stand on that corner, keeping Earl Caldwell's rule for another 41 years and another 41 after that. It was not a gift to Otis, she told him, when he tried to refuse it, the way the good ones always try to refuse it. It was an investment, she said, in the only thing she had seen in years that was worth investing in, which was a place where the rule on the wall was real. I have more money than I will ever spend, she said, and I have watched a great many people perform goodness for an audience. You did it in the back room of your own heart. For an old man you thought was nobody, when you thought the only witness was a room full of strangers who would forget by lunch. That is the rarest thing I know of, Mr. Caldwell. And I have decided to make sure it does not get torn down to put up something with a better profit margin. Your father built something true on this corner. I am simply making sure the corner stays under it. And there was more. Because Ada Presley was thorough. And because the video had put a name and a face to a thing the whole city suddenly wanted to do something about. There was, within the month, a fund seeded by Ada and swollen by the donations that poured in from the millions who had watched, dedicated to the exact problem the morning had revealed. The old and forgotten veterans living at the knife's edge in that city. And its first and most important act was to take care of Clarence Boyd. He never spent another cold morning in a barely heated room. He was moved, with his fierce dignity carefully preserved so that it felt like a thing he had earned and not a thing he was given, into a warm and decent place, his small bills handled, his medications covered, his table at Caldwell's waiting for him every single morning. The best table, the one in the window, with his name. The staff understood. On it forever. Earl Caldwell had carried Clarence Boyd half a mile under fire. And then, 50 years later, from beyond the grave, through a rule screwed to a wall and a son who kept it and a stranger who saw it, had reached back and carried him the rest of the way home. And it was not only Clarence. That was the thing about what the morning set loose, that it would not stay the size of one man. The fundata seeded and the city swelled, went looking deliberately for the others. The ones the morning had made suddenly visible. The old soldiers in single rooms all over the city, living the exact life Clarence had been living. Rationing heat, counting coins, too proud to ask and too forgotten to be offered. And one by one it found them, and quietly, with their dignity carefully kept intact, made their last years warm. Caldwell's became the center of it, the place where the city's overlooked veterans knew they could come, not for charity. Otis would never once have used that word, but for what Earl had always called it, what was owed. Earl's rule, which for 41 years had fed whoever happened through the door, became almost overnight a small institution, a hot breakfast every morning for any veteran who came, paid for now by a fund and a city that had been reminded, by a minute-and-a-half video and an old man's tears, of a debt it had been comfortable forgetting. Otis hired 2 more cooks. His father's griddle ran from before dawn to past dark. And it fed that first year more hungry and forgotten people than Earl Caldwell had managed to feed in 30. And Otis liked to think, working it late at night, that his father could see it, and was, wherever he was, finally able to set down a thing he had been carrying half a mile his whole life. 1 year later, on a cold, bright January morning, Caldwell's was the warmest corner in Pittsburgh, full from open to close. And at the best table in the window sat an old man in a clean new coat over the same threadbare field jacket he would not give up, holding court because Clarence Boyd had become the heart of the place. The other regulars came to see. The old soldier who told the young ones, gently, the things he had learned, and who sat every morning beneath the framed photograph of the brother who had saved his life twice, once in a rice paddy and once from a wall. Otis had moved his father's flag and the brass plate to hang directly over Clarence's table, so that the rule and the man it had been written for sat together. And most mornings, if you came in, you would find the 2 of them there, Otis and Clarence, the son of the man and the man himself, drinking coffee. And you would not have been able to say which one was taking better care of the other. They had each been, in their different ways, the last of something. When that morning brought them together, Clarence was the last man alive who had known young Earl Caldwell, who could tell Otis the things a son never gets to know, what his father had been like at 19, the jokes he told, the way he sang badly and constantly, the particular sound of his laugh in a place that had little to laugh about. And Otis drank those stories down like a man who had been thirsty for 30 years without knowing it. Because grief for a parent never really ends. It just goes quiet. And here was a man who could make Earl Caldwell briefly alive again across a cafe table. And Otis was, for Clarence, the first person in longer than he could remember who needed him for something, who waited for him to arrive in the morning, who was diminished a little on the days he did not come. They gave each other, those 2, the 2 things the old and the grieving most run out of, which are a reason to get up and someone who notices when you do. An old man who had been ready, that cold morning, to shuffle off into the snow and out of the world entirely. found himself instead with somewhere to be every single day, and someone glad that he was there. And there is no fund and no fortune that can buy that. It can only be given, person to person, the way Earl Caldwell had always known, the way the brass plate had said all along. They will tell you that loneliness kills the old as surely as any illness, that an isolated heart simply gives out sooner. And the reverse is true too. Though it is harder to measure that a person with somewhere to be and someone to be there for can find years he did not know he had left. Clarence Boyd found years. He held that table in the window for a long time, longer than anyone expected. And he was not cold, and he was not alone for a single day of them. And when his time finally did come, it came in a warm room, with Otis Caldwell holding his hand, the way Earl had held on in the water, the way the family you choose holds on at the end. Nobody left behind, nobody put out into the cold. The rule kept all the way to the last morning. Tree still worked there. Otis had not fired him, which had surprised people. But Otis understood something his father had taught him, that the boy's shame was the most valuable thing in the room that morning. Because a person who cannot live with what he did wrong is a person who is going to spend the rest of his life doing right. And Trey did. He became, of all of them, the fiercest keeper of Earl's rule, the first to spot a cold or hungry old soldier coming through the door, the first to bring the coffee before it was asked for. And when people asked him why he cared so much, he told them the truth, that he had once put a hero out into the snow, and that he was never, as long as he lived, going to let it happen again on his watch. Grant Holloway, for what it is worth, was never seen at Caldwell's again. And the development group built their glass tower somewhere else, and the corner stayed exactly what it had been for 41 years, which was a promise, and the apron. Otis had set his apron on the counter that morning when he took it off, the gesture that started everything, and afterward he could not bring himself to just put it back on as if nothing had happened. So he had it framed, the old flour-dusted apron, and he hung it on the wall too, beside his father's flag and his father's photograph and the brass plate with the rule. And beneath the apron, he put a small plate of his own, with his own words on it, the words he had said in the snow without thinking that turned out to be the truest thing he knew. Sometimes keeping the promise means taking off the apron. People who came in would ask what it meant, and Otis would point to the old man at the window table and tell them the whole story, the snow and the 85 cents and the photograph and the brother carried half a mile under fire. And by the end of it, they would understand. And they would be changed a little, the way you are changed by being reminded of the thing you already knew and had let yourself forget, which is that there is no such thing as a person who is nobody, and that the cold morning you decide to find out is the morning everything can turn. I want to tell you something here at the end, the way I do. When I wrote this story, I kept thinking about how easy it is to be the room, not the cruel man at the window. Most of us are not him, and not even the frightened kid, though more of us are him than will admit it. The easy thing, the thing almost all of us do, almost all of the time, is to be the room, the people at the other tables who saw it was wrong and looked at their plates and let it happen because it was not our place, because someone else would handle it, because we did not want the trouble. The whole story turns on one man deciding not to be the room. He took off his apron, which is to say, he stepped out of his role, out of the safe thing, out of staying in the back and keeping the paying customer happy, and he walked into the cold. And you do not have to own the café to do that. You can be the retiree who gets up and crosses the room to shake a hand. You can be the kid who runs for the orange juice. You can be the one person who decides, in a room full of people looking at their plates, to look up instead. So let me leave you with a question tonight. When was the last time you were the room and wished afterward you had been the owner? What would it take the next time to take off your apron and walk into the cold? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and it always means more than you know. And one real thing before I go. Because this story is gentle, but the trouble in it is real. And there is very likely an old soldier within a mile of you living closer to that cold room than you would ever guess. If you are a veteran, or you love one, who is struggling, alone, or at risk of losing housing, please know there is help and that you have more than earned the asking. The National Call Center for Homeless Veterans is staffed around the clock at 1-877-424-3838. And your local VFW or Veteran Service Office can connect you to people whose whole purpose is to make sure no one who served grows old cold or alone. And if there is an elderly veteran on your block, the one you nod to, the one who keeps to himself, this week, knock on the door. Bring the coffee. You have no idea what a person carried home from a war, or how long it has been since someone looked at them and saw it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would take off their apron and walk into the cold. Subscribe for a new story every week. And the next time you are tempted to be the room, remember Otis Caldwell, and remember that you never, ever know which forgotten old man at the counter is the answer to a prayer somebody wrote on a wall 50 years ago. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.